The trade! The whispering voices surged, echoing from the walls, pressing into his skull. The voices weren't random, they were his own, speaking in fragmented sentences he didn't remember saying. Shadows crawled along the edges of the room, stretching toward him like grasping hands. The air turned icy, his breath visible in the dim candlelight. A sensation like cold fingers traced the back of his neck, making his skin crawl. Somewhere behind him, a door creaked open on its own. His body stiffened. His reflection lifted a hand. His real hand mirrored it, unwilling. A slow pull, like the guest book. Ethan backed away. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. His instincts screamed run, but his body refused. At the far end of the room, a single book lay open on a pedestal. His name was already written inside. Ethan Shaw, guest of honor. The ink was still wet. His breath came in short gasps as the whispering grew louder, shaping into something almost familiar. It was his own voice. The reflection that wasn't his. A mirror stood tall in the corner of the room. Ethan hesitated before stepping closer, an inexplicable weight settling in his chest. Something inside him whispered, "Don't look," but his curiosity overpowered the warning. As he took another step, the room seemed to contract, the candlelight flickering violently as if resisting his movement. The surface was too dark, too deep, like a pool of ink rather than glass. The longer Ethan stared, the more it seemed to ripple, as if something inside was moving. And then, just before he looked away, his reflection tilted its head, but he hadn't moved. The glass was cracked, but the fractures moved, slowly crawling outward like veins. At first, it reflected only the dim candlelight, but then, in the periphery of his vision, Ethan saw something standing behind him. Too tall, too thin, watching. When he turned, there was nothing there. The glass was fogged over, not with condensation, but with something moving beneath the surface, like ripples in black water. For a split second, a handprint appeared on the inside of the glass, pressing outward, fingers twitching before fading away. Ethan's reflection stared back at him, except it didn't. His reflection's eyes were wrong, too dark, too deep, like a doorway leading somewhere he shouldn't go. Then, slowly, it smiled, not with Ethan's lips, with something else's. The reflection stepped forward, but Ethan hadn't moved. Title: The Hollow Guest Eye, the invitation that shouldn't exist. The letter arrived with no return address. The envelope was sealed with a wax emblem he didn't recognize, an unfamiliar sigil that seemed to shimmer under the dim light. As Ethan ran his fingers over it, a strange chill crawled up his spine, as though something unseen had just taken notice of him. The envelope felt oddly heavy, its surface cold to the touch, as if it had been sitting somewhere dark and damp for far too long. The paper was old, yellowed, and the ink looked faded, yet fresh at the same time. Your presence is requested at the Hollow Manor. Midnight. Come alone. Ethan Shaw had never heard of Hollow Manor. No map listed it. No online searches led anywhere. But as a freelance journalist chasing urban legends, that only made him more curious. By 11:45 p.m., he was standing at the edge of the woods, staring at an iron gate that hadn't been there before. Through the twisted bars, a mansion loomed in the fog, its windows yawning black like hollow eyes, watching. The fog curled unnaturally around its structure, as if whispering secrets only the house could understand. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open, though no footsteps followed. The sound lingered longer than it should have, like an echo in a place where sound should not exist. Its windows yawning black like hollow eyes, watching. The fog curled unnaturally around its structure, as if whispering secrets only the house could understand. Its windows dark and hollow, as if they had never known light. The air around it felt thick, charged with something unseen, something waiting. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the walls, shifting even though there was no wind to move them. Tall, lifeless, yet somehow watching. The gate groaned open by itself. Something about the air felt thick, wrong, like stepping into a dream that didn't belong to him. 2. The house that breathed. As Ethan crossed the threshold, the heavy wooden doors shut behind him with a finality that made his chest tighten. The house was vast, its grand halls lined with portraits of people whose eyes seemed to track his movements. Some figures in the paintings had their hands pressed against the canvas, their fingers bent at unnatural angles, as if trapped inside. The further he walked, the more he noticed, their expressions changing, warping, twisting into something hungry. As he walked past, he swore he saw one of the figures blink. Another seemed to shift slightly, its mouth curling into an almost imperceptible grin before returning to stillness. Some faces were blurred, distorted, as if they had been smeared by unseen hands. Others looked too real, as if they had been watching for a very long time. The chandeliers flickered with candlelight, though no one had lit them. Somewhere deep in the manor, a clock chimed once. But when he looked at it, the hands pointed to midnight, unmoving. Then the whispering began. Not loud, not external. It was inside his head. The silent hosts. A grand dining hall stretched before him, its long table set with plates of food untouched by time. Around it, figures sat stiffly in antique chairs, dressed in clothing from different centuries. None of them moved. None of them breathed. Their faces were too still, too hollow. Then, as if pulled by invisible strings, they all turned their heads toward him in perfect unison and smiled.